In 1968, Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry had gotten word from the network executives that his show was resting firmly on the cancellation bubble. Should the worst come to pass, Roddenberry decided to use the second season finale as a backdoor pilot. Now, what's a backdoor pilot? Well, it's when an episode of an ongoing television series is dedicated to the introduction of a possible spin-off via the appearance of a new character. Some examples would include how episodes of Happy Days were used to launch Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy, respectively. Also, an episode of JAG was used to launch the NCIS franchise.
The episode was titled Assignment Earth. The proposed series would also have carried that title. And it revolved the USS Enterprise traveling back to the present day, in 1968 terms, Earth. While conducting research, Kirk, Spock, and the rest of the crew came across a time-traveling spy named Gary 7. 7 was sent back to prevent the United States from launching an armed nuclear satellite, which would have escalated tensions with the Soviet Union.
Just try to ignore the fact that in 1967, both the Americans and the Soviets signed a treaty promising not to use space as a launching point for nuclear weapons.
Anyway, 7 was joined by Roberta Lincoln, a ditzy secretary hired by 7's predecessors, and Isis, 7's cat, who was revealed at the end of the episode to be a shapeshifter. Eventually, 7 and the others work with the Enterprise crew to destroy the satellite and avert World War III.
The episode is not very good. In fact, I would actually say it's very not good. Basically, the whole episode consists of Gary 7 and Roberta Lincoln running around while Kirk and Spock dunder their way through the background talking about how amazing and cool Gary 7 is. And that's the inherent problem with the backdoor pilot. Characters people actually tune in to see get pushed to the background for the sake of individuals that they have no idea who they are. I mean, it's not like people tuned in to Married with Children to see the two guys who ran the radio station at the college Bud Bundy attended. No, they tuned in to see Bud Bundy clumsily hit on a girl, possibly by reviving his Grandmaster B persona, only to be rejected.
One last note about the episode. It marked one of the earliest roles for Academy Award-winning actress Terry Garr. Garr had such a horrible experience working on Assignment Earth that she refuses to talk about it to this very day.
And considering the fact that Terry Garr's resume includes a movie called Mom and Dad Save the World, that speaks volumes.
If my previous comments haven't made it clear, Assignment Earth was not picked up for a series. NBC instead opted for a third season of Star Trek and removed Gene Roddenberry from having creative control on that season. However, that wouldn't be the end for Gary 7, Roberta Lincoln, and Isis. They would appear in a few Star Trek novels, most notably in the first 2 books of the Eugenics Wars trilogy, and Gary would appear in several issues of Star Trek comic books published by DC when they had the license in the early 90s.
In 2008, writer-artist John Byrne took up the idea of continuing Gary 7's adventures in IDW Publishing's 5-issue miniseries that wondered what would have happened had Assignment Earth actually been picked up for a series. And that's what we're covering today. So here is Star Trek Assignment Earth.
3 months after their encounter with the Enterprise, Gary and Roberta travel with Isis to Albuquerque, New Mexico. There they try to break into a building. 7 uses Isis's shape-shifting abilities to break inside. Isis returns to Cap form as Gary and Roberta inspect an office. It's then that someone enters. Thankfully, Gary 7 has come prepared.
The device Gary 7 uses is called the Servo, and it's sort of a catch-all device that can do just about anything. It can pick locks, it can hypnotize people, it can disarm weapons. And in case you are wondering, no, I could not find any information to support any idea that this was somehow based on the sonic screwdriver from the British series Doctor Who.
It turns out the office is home to Russian spies who are planning to sabotage a nuclear weapon test called Hercules via an inside man on the project. Gary and Roberta beam back to New York City to regroup.
Gary 7's New York office is home to a supercomputer from the future called Beta 5, which Roberta later dubs Betty affectionately. Beta 5 has a special transportation device that allows it to beam Gary and Roberta and Isis anywhere in the world. It can even alter their wardrobes if needed. Gary also carries a small green cube which works as a remote scanning device for Beta 5.
Gary and Roberta return to New Mexico where they pose as newly appointed members of the Hercules research team, which is led by a woman named Diana Winters. They are questioned by one member of the team, a Dr. Truman, but the other members don't pay any mind. Once alone with Diana, Gary uses the servo to briefly hypnotize her and find out more information on Hercules. Hercules is an advanced fusion bomb that, if used improperly, could destroy all life on Earth. Diana then takes Gary to the location of the Hercules warhead and gives him a tour of the facility where the mastermind behind the bomb, a Chinese defector named Dr. Wang, is conducting some tests. Feeling that Wang may not have really defected, Gary has ISIS track Wang down to his apartment, while he treats Diana to dinner, dancing, and more.
Oh, don't be so shocked. Assignment Earth was clearly an attempt to cash in on the late 60s spy craze.
Gary returns to New York and has Beta 5 run background diagnostics on each member of the Hercules team. None of them appear to have anything to hint at being a double agent. The next day, everyone prepares for the underground test of Hercules except for Dr. Truman, who is missing. Meanwhile, Diana begins to conduct a final inspection of the warhead before it goes off. However, she's immediately confronted by a gun-wielding Truman. Gary 7 arrives and hypnotizes Truman with the servo. He then hands Diana Truman's gun and tells her to halt the test on Hercules.
Q Akbar!
Diana pistol whips Gary and plants an explosive in the main operating computer for Hercules. She laughs off any question as to why and takes 7's servo. However, Diana is shot through the head by Smitty, the facility's guard, who grew suspicious when Diana took so long to finish the inspection. Gary then places the call to halt the test. Project Hercules is shut down after it is discovered that Diana's birth certificate is of a girl who died in a car accident in 1933. 1 year later, Gary and Roberta are finishing a report on their latest mission. It's then that Beta 5's emergency alarm goes off. The Enterprise has returned and is flying in Earth's atmosphere. Beta 5 runs a scan and concludes that this Enterprise is actually from an earlier time than the time that Gary and Roberta ran into Kirk and Spock. Gary and Roberta then watch in awe as an Air Force fighter jet is sent to intercept the Enterprise, only to be caught in the starship's tractor beam. The tractor beam is too strong for 60's construction, though, and it begins crushing the jet. Beta 5 then reports that the pilot was beamed off the jet just before it was destroyed.
Some of you may recognize this as the plot to the Star Trek Season 1 episode, Tomorrow is Yesterday. The pilot who got beamed aboard the Enterprise is named John Christopher, and his unborn son is fated to lead a special mission to Saturn, which plays a key role in Earth's space expansion. Now, it's up to Kirk and the rest of the Enterprise crew to figure out how to get John Christopher back to his base without destroying the whole timeline.
Realizing the possible destruction that could happen to the timeline, Gary and Roberta leap into action and get beamed to the wreckage of the jet. They're too late, though, and the film of the jet's encounter with the Enterprise has already been picked up by Air Force intelligence, leaving the two to sneak onto a nearby base, after using ISIS to distract the guards, in more ways than one. Gary and Roberta wander the halls and come across Kirk and Sulu beaming into the base. Gary and Roberta decide to remain hidden and make sure the Enterprise crew can pull this off. Right away, Kirk and Sulu get caught, but Sulu manages to beam out before Kirk gets taken away by the security.
Yes, we're still in Tomorrow is Yesterday. At this point in the episode, Spock was joined by Christopher in an attempt to rescue Kirk. Also, Gary and Roberta are staying in the background because they obviously have not yet encountered this incarnation of Kirk and Spock.
Eventually, Gary and Roberta run in some unknown interference on some security guards as Spock and Christopher complete rescuing Kirk. However, Gary must now take drastic measures to ensure the stability of the timeline. Gary and Roberta beam aboard the Enterprise to take out Christopher. However, the ship's shields block 7's attempt to communicate with Beta 5. It's then that the Enterprise jumps into warp and begins heading towards the sun. The ship is trying to travel back through time.
This is how Tomorrow is Yesterday ended, with the Enterprise trying to travel around the sun at warp 10 in an attempt to travel back in time. At that point, John Christopher was beamed back to Earth just before he took off, and this erases his memories of the Enterprise and her crew. And yes, the time traveling around the sun at warp 10 is the same plot device used in Star Trek 4.
Gary and Roberta witness Christopher entering the transporter room. Gary then conducts a test to make sure the Enterprise crew know what they're doing. He and Roberta will then beam back to New York, where they encounter their past selves, causing their memories to be erased as well. A little over a year later, Gary and Roberta are undercover at Illinois State University of Science and Technology. He's an instructor, she's a student. And they have been there for 3 weeks in 1971 and turned up nothing. Gary has decided to run a diagnostic scan on Beta 5 to see if she's running correctly. Roberta leaves to meet up with a campus group. The group is planning a massive anti-Vietnam conflict protest, so massive that the Illinois National Guard is being called in. Thankfully, the group is a new member who has filled everyone in on everything.
Yeah, it's just ISIS in disguise.
Meanwhile, Roberta makes plans with the group leader, a man named Curtis, as the meeting adjourns. Curtis reminds everyone to maintain peace. No one wants to repeat of the Kent State tragedy. It's then that ISIS goes back to Gary to report to everything that she's found out, just as he begins Beta 5's diagnostic scan. It's then that the two are caught by another professor named Eckhart, with ISIS barely returning to feline form in time. Eckhart then acts rather secretive as a general arrives to talk with him. This arouses Gary's suspicions. Unfortunately, Beta 5's scan means he can't do any diagnostics with it. Meanwhile, Roberta is out with Curtis. He explains the troops deserve help and not derision, and that people seem to forget that, and that they can still support the troops, but be against the war. The two then return to Roberta's apartment, where she kisses him goodnight. The next day, the protest is out. It starts to go smoothly, until somebody throws a bottle at a guardsman. Before shots can be fired, Curtis stands up and manages to talk everyone down. This is witnessed by Eckhart and the general, whose name is Corey. Meanwhile, Gary and ISIS inspect Eckhart's office. Due to the lack of computer help, they are forced to go analog, running through Eckhart's files. Eventually, Gary uses the servo to hypnotize Eckhart's secretary, who points them in the right direction. Gary then goes to talk to Eckhart, only for the professor to deny everything and leave with two identical-looking men. Meanwhile, Roberta and Curtis are back at her apartment, where things escalate in a different way.
Oh, don't be so shocked. It's a small Midwestern college in the middle of the free love era.
The next morning, the two men who are with Eckhart show up at Roberta's apartment and knock her unconscious and then abduct Curtis. Roberta comes to and runs to Gary. Gary uses Eckhart's file to track down his location. He and Roberta beam to the location, a secret underground lab. It's then that they discover what Eckhart was doing. He was making a cloned army of super soldiers in order to overrun the forces in Southeast Asia. Several soldiers begin to overwhelm Gary and Roberta. However, they get rescued by Curtis. The trio confront Eckhart and Corey. Corey pulls out a gun, only for it to suddenly vanish. This is followed by the clone soldiers vanishing. Beta 5 is up and running again, and has teleported everything to the uninhabited planet Nevega system. Gary then hypnotizes Eckhart and Corey and wipes their memory. He and Roberta and Curtis then return to New York City and explain everything to Curtis. They choose to leave Curtis's memory intact. 3 months later, Curtis is drafted and heeds the call. He explains to Roberta that he has to do the right thing, and she promises to wait.
Our story doesn't have a happy ending, though, as we jump forward to 2008, and Roberta Lincoln is taking her granddaughter to the Vietnam Memorial Wall, where she explains that Curtis was killed in action a few months after shipping out. They also get joined by ISIS in her human form as they pay tribute to Curtis.
A few months later, Roberta uses Beta 5 to try on a series of dresses for a big date she has that night.
Well, she got over Curtis's death pretty quickly, didn't she?
Gary 7 arrives and chastises Roberta for using Beta 5 in such a trivial manner. It's then that Beta 5 gets an alert something has hacked her programs for a file concerning Agents 347 and 201.
Okay, Agents 201 and 347 were Gary 7's predecessors on Earth. And they actually hired Roberta Lincoln, and their deaths took place just before the events of the Assignment Earth backdoor pilot.
Gary and Roberta return to Florida, where the episode Assignment Earth took place, under the guise of a married couple, though everyone thinks the two are really father and daughter. They check into the hotel where 201 and 347 were staying before they got killed. They use Beta 5 to scan the spy's old room. Beta 5 uses holographic technology to recreate 201 and 347's last mission. It turns out the two were investigating recent actions from something called Counter-Strike. This upsets Gary, and he leaves with Rebecca after dealing with the elderly couple whose room they just broke into. Gary goes on to explain to Roberta what Counter-Strike is. Counter-Strike is the name of an alien force that spent centuries sweeping across the galaxy, wiping out civilization after civilization. For a while, some races were able to resist Counter-Strike, forcing Counter-Strike to take a more subtle approach.
You mean like those websites that try to profit off the gambling from the weapons skins? Hey, if I had done this episode like 3 months ago, that would have been topical.
Counter-Strike might actually be behind Earth recently making a lot of leaps in weapons technology, like the Hercules bomb or the Super Soldier clones. Gary continues the holographic recreation, and he and Roberta see 201 and 347 getting run off the road by a truck. Gary and Roberta then go to the police to find out more about the accident, except the second Gary mentions the accident, the entire precinct draws their guns. Gary is able to hypnotize the officers with the servo, except for one who manages to wing Gary in the shoulder as he and Roberta leave. As Roberta races to the hospital to get help for Gary, the car suddenly disappears and then reappears on an alien ship, much to Roberta's shock. Gary manages to keep Roberta from using the servo. It wouldn't work on the ship, and it turns out this is a Counter-Strike ship. The ship is actually under attack from a different vessel that has incapacitated all but one crew member. Gary takes a gun and blows a hole in the ship's hull. As he and Roberta are sucked out into space, Gary and Roberta then get teleported onto the ship that was attacking the previous ship. The one that isn't a Counter-Strike ship. Gary then passes out, and the aliens on board heal him up. Afterwards, Gary and Roberta return with an alien to New York, where Gary explains everything.
Okay, explanation time here. This is the race of beings that took care of Gary 7 when he was orphaned and trained him in the future to become a contemporary agent of the 1960s. They don't have an official name in canon, though some supplemental material refers to them as the Aegis. Also, there's a backup story where ISIS catches a mugger. That is all.
Jumping ahead to February of 1972, Gary and Roberta manage to sneak on board Air Force One as President Nixon prepares to fly to Beijing to open up relations with China. Both are aware of the importance of this trip.
As the ancient Vulcan proverb goes, only Nixon could go to China.
As the presidential motorcade arrives at the hotel, Gary and Roberta are greeted by a fellow agent named Hey Mao.
Yeah, it's ISIS in disguise again.
ISIS takes Gary and Roberta to Nixon's suite where they scan it with Beta 5 and turn up nothing. That night, the three attend a gala being thrown for Nixon and Mao Zedong. ISIS then breaks away to spy on Nixon as he rests. When Nixon gets up to use the John, he gets jumped by someone who has had plastic surgery to look exactly like the president. ISIS then gets the information to Gary and Roberta, who beam into Nixon's suite and hypnotize the imposter. They then find the hidden entrance the imposter used. They make their way to find Nixon being held by several KGB agents. Gary uses the servo to hypnotize the agents and set about freeing Nixon. The imposter Nixon comes to and begins to scuffle with the president. In the midst of the fight, one of the Nixons grabs a gun. The gun then goes off. Gary and Roberta arrive to find a dead Nixon. Gary has no choice. He uses the servo to hypnotize the living Nixon and convince him that he is the Richard Nixon, even if he actually is the real Richard Nixon. 2 years later, Gary and Roberta return from an off-Earth mission to the news of Nixon resigning the presidency. Which means even if this was the imposter Nixon, it's all pointless now.
Also, we have a backup story where ISIS gets pranked by Roberta Lincoln, possibly revealing that Roberta knows about the cat's shape-shifting abilities. That is all. And that does conclude Star Trek Assignment Earth. How was it? Well, it's pretty darn good. There's some really good, strong storytelling and characterization throughout. Roberta Lincoln does not come across nearly as ditzy as she does in the original backdoor pilot Assignment Earth. There's really top-notch artwork along with this, and had Assignment Earth actually been picked up for a series, I do think it could have gone a lot like how this went. That being said, I do have a couple of problems with it. First off, in the second issue, the Tomorrow is Yesterday from a Different Perspective story, for some reason they didn't show Kirk and Spock at all. They just they did some creative blocking and obscured their faces. That doesn't make any sense because in the first issue of the series they had no problem showing Kirk and Spock. Also, some of the stories kind of feel a little out of order. I did the joke with, Roberta seemed to very quickly get over Curtis's death. Well, it maybe could have worked better had that story, the third story, actually been the last story in this. That way, maybe Roberta doesn't seem to be callously going out on a date when she's supposed to be mourning the loss of the love of her life. But those are pretty minor quibbles. Overall, I am going to give Star Trek Assignment Earth a B. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.